Please watch this video in full if you watch nothing else by me. In terms of video content, please make in this video and all the other parts that have preceded it for my scientific proposals. This video specifically pertains to two new theories that I've come up with in recent times, and as well as going over some more specifics in regards to my other theoretical and implementation work, as well as just showcasing my new laminated diagrams, and also going over, I guess, just citing specific individuals who have influenced my work more than I previously have in these videos. So, yes, thank you for watching, and I hope it's beneficial to you. Well, I think I've put this video off for far too long by this point. I originally wanted to record this on October 31st, Halloween, and with that being outside. But, well, the day dragged on, and couldn't find an adequate place to film in the area of the city that I was in outside. So I just ended up postponing this. Then I thought I would just, well, record it the next day on November 1st, which the beginning clip of this video and the ending clip of it with me in the face makeup were both recorded on November 1st. But, well, I was going to do it that day, and it got preoccupied with some other things and didn't pan out either. Then I thought, okay, I'll record it on November 2nd. That didn't work out. Got preoccupied again. Then I thought, okay, the 3rd. And that turned into the 4th, which turned into the 5th, which turned into the 6th. And now it's November 7th. And I've unfortunately received some rather saddening, disheartening news in regards to my living situation. But, well, I'll discuss that in a separate video. But, well, because of that, I figured, well, do it now. But before I get into, well, my my two new theories, I want to correct one thing from a previous video I made in one of my exploring series for cityscapes, and the other for the last video I uploaded in regards to a certain, in terms of expansionism, still moderate corporation. So, first thing, in my video exploring Gatineau Part 3, when I was showcasing the downtown area of the city and the mass expansionism of corporate entities and gentrification and post-suburbanism, I got to a certain area that was by a recreation center and also a cultural center, right by the private bus transit road, the Rapid Bus Corridor in the downtown area. Right by there was a building that was called Center Slush Puppy. And I had thought, and I said this in that video, that the building was Slush Puppy's corporate headquarters, the mega corporate slushy producer, the product, the artificial, horribly produced product, beverage that's sold not just in Canada, but apparently all over the world. But I believe it did originate in Canada. Well, apparently that isn't their headquarters, as the original corporation, the company that had created Slush Puppy, sold the properties of it, the rights to the branding of the drink, and I guess, maybe did some sort of a merger in terms of corporate takeover with the American company known as the IC Company, which, yes, for those of you who are wondering, they are the corporation that mass manufactures, or I think on the larger scene of it during the 1990s, various artificially crafted treats, were one of the first to make the, icy, slushy color pops, the crushed ice treats that are soaked in the artificial solutions that come in the plastic tubes, those things. The IC Company, in fact, they're so known for that those American ice treats are basically just known as ices, just worldwide. So Slush Puppy was bought out by them, and now widespread not just across Canada but in the United States, and they might have even expanded to Australia. I'm not entirely sure, but now international, branded as such, and the product is sold, and manufacturing for the slushy product is all done under the executive control of the IC Company, which, if I'm not mistaken from what I had researched, their corporate headquarters is, I think it's somewhere in the American state of Tennessee. But so, just to go back to my Exploring Gatineau video, so I was wrong. That building was not their corporate headquarters. That was actually that was actually a stadium in the city. In fact, it's the biggest stadium in all of Gatineau. Now, if you're wondering why is it called Slush Puppy Center, or Center Slush Puppy, your guess is as good as mine. Maybe some affiliation of the original company that created the slushy drink. Maybe they started somewhere in Gatineau, or one of the executives or some important figure within the company was from Gatineau, Canada. I don't know. I couldn't find anything as to why it was actually renamed that. It wasn't originally called Center Slush Puppy. It was named after, I think, a hockey player who was from Gatineau, Quebec. So, granted, in hindsight, I should have done further research into the building itself while I was there. I just assumed because it was branded, it said Center Slush Puppy. I thought that I meant, because a lot of things in terms of, well, head locations for, say, any executive enforcement, at least in terms of private sector here in Quebec, often start, or things where there's some sort of events that are held, so yes, arenas, but also a governmental facility of some sort, start with center, so on, so on. But, well, yeah, apparently it's a stadium, so I was wrong about that. And, yeah, it's beyond my knowledge right now as to why it was called Center Slush Puppy. But so I just wanted to take a moment to correct that. Now, the second thing, in regards to the corporate conglomerate that is Desjardins, who are one of the two rulers of the city of Lévis, Quebec. And all of its, and have their foot in every single sector of the municipality's economy. Well, apparently, I had done further research on them, and I've been keeping up with Desjardins for quite a while since being in Quebec, and ongoings in relation to them, at least as of this point right now. And I had, for the longest while, especially in regards to expansionism, which I still do, considered them to be of the status of a moderate corporate entity. Well, in regards to net growth, yearly net growth, which I guess the information that I looked at prior, it must have been outdated for the online sources I had found. It must have been outdated, because I had thought they, being the banking and insurance company that they are, I thought they had roughly a yearly growth rate of about maybe 150 million, maybe anywhere between 120 and 150 million per year, ranking in terms of profit. No, apparently though, whatever I looked at, I guess might have been wrong, because now, and this wasn't too long ago, so they could not, I do not think they've grown this much in that short of time. Now, apparently the most current accurate percentage of their yearly net growth is somewhere around 400 billion. $400 billion in yearly profitability, yearly profit growth. So, in terms of amalgamation of wealth, they very much are at the point of practically being a mega-corporate entity, just a not near as expansionist mega-corporate entity. But with, I'm sure, whatever development company is in the has pair deals with them, or if they have their own development sector of their company for constructing their branches and buying out, well, lot placements for them in various cities and towns across the province. Well, in terms of expansionism, they're going to hit that soon enough. So that's, I guess, just a slight add-on to that bit of information about one of the kings of the Viz Canada. Okay, so those were the two things I just wanted to quickly address. Now, on to the main portion of this video. So, in the last little while, in regards to trying to type out my theoretical work, I had been getting some other ideas, well, same ideas that I had before, but further analyzing them and contemplating whether these ideas were individual enough to not group them in just solely with the rest of my hypotheses, but outline them as entirely separate theories. And eventually, I decided that, yes, I think they are deserving of being outlined as separate theories. So, I'm going to discuss that here. And then, like I said in the intro, go into individuals who have influenced my ideas and also further elaborate on certain revisions to my work and just, I guess, further elaborate on them in general. November 8th. So, the ontological inherency of intersectionality. Philosophy, ontology. I submit the following conclusion that the philosophical concept of intersectionality / intersectionalism is not only crucially connected or has extensively important connections between various scientific fields and realms of human life and engagement, but is inherently rooted in all facets of physical and metaphysical existence in and of itself, which includes human life, other animal species, and non-living organisms within shared environmental space. So, I've talked here and there about, well, what is in essence intersectionality, and I mentioned it a few times. But just to reiterate, clarify, intersectionality is the idea it spans across all fields, or all subspecialties in philosophy. But it's the concept that there are crucial points of connection that directly affect and relate to another realm of existence, or another concept within life that determines, at the very least, certain outcomes or things that occur within that realm of existence. And specifically in terms of ontology, well, ontology in philosophy is the study of the nature of existence, or how existence manifests itself amongst various living or non-living entities in the known universe. Basically, just how things exist within, well, reality. In this regard, I feel it is provable, as I think that I've demonstrated greatly on this channel and with my other scientific proposals, that intersectionality is intrinsic to every facet of life, to a point where you cannot discuss or examine or orient yourself in a given scenario without it affecting another element of yours and others' daily activities. And in that, seeing as it's inherently rooted by this proposal of mine within, well, all of existence in and of itself, you cannot separate another realm of understanding, of conceptual knowledge, and also in terms of its other metaphysical and then physical presences. You cannot
separate how one realm of an environment, an environmental setting, affects another. Therefore, every decision you make morally will inevitably have, in relation to my theory of the ripple perspective, have a ripple effect on someone else's livelihood. What are some examples I could give? Well, let's go with the field of psychology in and of itself. So, the field of psychology, as I'm sure many of you watching this know, but if you don't, is the study of the emotional state of human beings, as well as can branch out into other forms of animal biology, and the treatment of disorders and conditions that are associated to trauma in relation to the psyche. In more of modern times, there has been more, sadly, performatively and non-beneficially, for the most part, attempts in various countries across the world to implement so-called stronger regulatory treatment options for the development of psychiatric illnesses. And in just the general populaces of the world, psychological health, bonjour, has, in terms of genuine knowledge towards it, to some degree, has become more readily available, more readily discussed. However, amongst that, there is the idea that the field of psychology, as well as every other field, is separate to itself. It's separate from, well, it's confined to itself, more so. It's separate from any other field of research. It has no effect, or the fact that emotional disorders have no effect on other realms of life. Well, this is completely untrue. Let's just take the notion of sociology, the entire field of sociology, as another example. Sociology is the study of how civilizations and cultural phenomenons amongst people groups come about, how historically they've formed, and in a current sense how they operate overall. And this includes what are provably morally corrupt atrocities that have happened governmentally, economically, socioculturally. Most people would probably think, well, there is no connection between sociology and psychology. Well, there is. Let's take those within powerful positions amongst the society that are considered dominant elitists, that suppress various demographics of people. You can insert for whatever reason. Well, as far as is provable, the reason for the provably morally corrupt sociopathic behavior of the elites towards the demographics that are suppressed is exactly that. Because of destructive social moral values that have become apparent amongst the ideologic culture of the elitist factions. This has led to disrupt to natural human psychological function, as far as I'm concerned, disrupt to our 5 subconscious desires, interactive loneliness, and most often overactivity of biologic thanatophobic reactions. This has led to traumatization of individuals who are a part of the elitist communities. And in that has led to psychological disorders forming. That, as far as I'm concerned, the basis of disorder, all would be classified as disorders if, and only if, and I'll talk more about this later, they disrupt socialization, pro-socialization with other human beings on a beneficial collective basis. That is the only reason as to why, or, well, along with that, that's the predominant reason as to why, or in terms of mass manipulation and coercion, those who are within elitist factions, raised in them, born into them, if they are indoctrinated into the beliefs of whatever societal systems keep their hierarchical position of power without any real presence, lack of compassion in relation to the personality disorder of sociopathy or another psychiatric illness, to any sort of major extent in regards to emotional disrupt. but genuinely believe and maybe have the idea that what they're doing is beneficial and helpful for the community and society that they are part of, or that those who are amongst the oppressed groups, well, they don't see it as oppression. They see their position as being beneficial for the collective of all peoples within their society. So I guess it's like correction, those are the only two options. But that is still a relation to what would be considered subcategory in relation to psychology and sociology of psychosociology. So, there's one connection. So what's another one? So, okay, let's take, once again, the field of sociology in relation to, specifically, study of ideology, sociological ideals that have formed amongst civilization, and the fields of ecology and meteorology. So, ecology is the study, the examination of the physical and metaphysical environmental systems within the natural world. Now, there is a category for human ecology, but let's go specifically with non-human ecological function. So, I'll say how any other animal life functions within the shared environment, or different microorganisms within water systems, or the plant life of the surrounding areas, how they function together. Meteorology is the study of the weather systems, how weather manifests and controls, well, the temperatures of given areas of the globe, the locational, seasonal phenomenons, and things of the sort. So, once again, it is often thought by many, sadly, that these two fields of research, facets of existence, have nothing to do with one another, at least by a certain portion of the global populace. But in reality, in regards for sociological phenomenons, we know how our actions very clearly affect those two fields of research, and I'm going to cut to the chase with, I think you know which one what I would mention for the most major disruptors to proper ecological and meteorological function, that being capitalism, the eco-political ideology of capitalism in and of itself, and with that, production and overconsumption of natural resources, complete depletion of them. So, within capitalist fascism, the entire ideology is built upon the idea of singular, privatized control, economic control, policy, in that regard, policy enforcement of an establishment by an individual person or a higher executive group with complete provisional rights over operations of a business entity. And also, within the ideology, allowance of complete use of natural resources in any, at least in sort of a Smithian or objectivist outline of capitalism, complete use of any natural resources, any amount, for tradable and taxable free market financial gain. Completely condoned. And in that, as we all know, or at least those of us who actually pay attention and research know, that this will inevitably, and has inevitably, led to the mass over-manufacturing and overusage of raw materials, and fueled the other ideology and sociological phenomenon of consumerism, and also on top of that, the ideology of materialism, of mass populist consumption of resources for unnecessary, to a major extent in terms of how much is consumed, an unnecessary amount of gratification to soothe or try and bring about emotional fulfillment. Well, there's another connection. This overproduction in relation to, let's go with the most easy one to target right now that I can think of, the mass extraction of oil, petroleum, fossil fuels from the earth to fuel transportation for further overproduction or overproduced products to distribute for selling, for the operations of over-manufactured machinery in factory facilities all over the world, and unnecessary usage of other machinery such as vehicles in that regard in relation to transport, just solely for getting individuals from one travel destination to another. Even when, for say a certain amount of distance a person is going, the vehicle would realistically be completely unnecessary for them to use. This has led to the over-emitting, or the mass emissions of carbon pollution compounds into the air. And with the mass amount of privatized factory facilities there are in the world, again, all condoned within the ideological principles of capitalist rhetoric for further production and private profit gain, is tolerated. So with the amount of fossil fuels being burnt, and I guess I'll add in here as well, with also the growing sociologic phenomenon of performative environmentalism, where venture capitalists and objectivists, those of elitist factions within corporate entities, or who have built entire corporations around the concept, have begun utilizing unsustainable so-called methods of environmental protection in order to convince major populaces of the world that, well, that corporatocracy is doing something about their specific contributions to destroying the natural world. One of the biggest, well, some of the biggest movements in that regard would be electrical machinery in high amounts using lithium. Lithium minerals. As well as, say, mass-produced gigantic wind turbine fields. Which are not made from sustainable material at all. Which, in doing so to obtain materials as such, for the production of these so-called environmentally friendly products, puts the same amount of fossil fuels and destroys practically the same amount of natural resources and overuses the same amount of natural resources as non-environmentally, or, well, blatantly non-environmentally friendly products do. And all of this, in regards to, say, specifically fossil fuels, in regards to meteorologic research, there has been a clear rise in global temperature fluctuation, with growing over the decades, massively, sporadically unpredictable weather conditions all across different regions of the Earth, where in the past, locally, the weather conditions and temperatures, specifically the temperatures in that regard, were not as extensively swung either one way or another, or as malleable as they've become. We've also seen how mass carbon emissions have destroyed the ozone layer of the globe, which aids in oxygen production, as far as I'm aware, of the natural plant life, especially in regards to different tree species. In that regard, relating to botany, botanology, and dendrology. this has disrupted the other animal life forms on the planet. In these ecosystems, how they function with the other species. In said environments. When one species, say if because of global emissions, certain vegetation was to die off in an area, something that may have never been seen before on a global level, historically speaking. Well, the species tries to migrate to another area where the climate overall they aren't accustomed to. As we are not in a state, the globe, as it was millions of years ago at the moment, especially in relation to human life, we're not in a state as we were back when the mass migrations of human beings happened millennia ago. And again, with the fluctuating temperatures being completely unpredictable for vegetation growth in this regard, well, say the species migrates out of an area. They get to an area where the temperatures are far too sporadic. There's not an adequate enough amount of whatever vegetation was originally in the environments they inhabited locally before. And because of this, they begin to die off one by one until being a threatened species or becoming extinct, or in that regard endangered before extinct. Let's say on top of that, that species was the food source, the main food source for another species in that original ecosystem. Well, if that main food source is now gone, they would either have to try and migrate. Well, they may try and migrate to another area, but again, not able to find an adequate amount of that original species to feast on. And then, once again, just like their nutrition, begin to die off. And again, this causes a further chain effect. Or the connectivity of the ecosystem begins to break down. So, there's that one. Let's do one more example for this theory. So, in relation to the medical field of neurology, in regards to neuroscience in its entirety, and also, again, relating to, in this regard, relating to psychology. So, neurology relates to the study, treatment, and all-around complete functioning of the nervous system. Let's go again specifically in relation to human biology. study of the cerebral cortex, the cerebellar cortex, the limbic system, the brainstem within the cranial structure, portion of the central nervous system, and the spinal cord for the central nervous system. Then branching out into the peripheral nervous system, which encompasses the autonomic nervous system, all involuntary functions, control of all involuntary bodily functions, the sympathetic nervous system, control for the relaxation and tension release for any physical function of the body in regards to peripheral function, and the parasympathetic nervous system, control of any peripheral anxiety, stress responses for buildup of tension, and physical functionality in said tension. But in specific regards to the connection between psychology and neurology, it is often thought, sadly still in the modern day, that the two fields, though having connections in regards to the literal process of emotions being headed by the central nervous system in regards to the frontal cortex, the prefrontal cortex, the occipital cortex, the temporal cortex, striatum, nucleus accumbens, hypothalamus, the hippocampus, etc., etc., as if they are not directly linked, as if the study of emotions and the emotional process is only merely connected in fragments to the physical neurotissue and neurocell structures of our physiologies. As far as I'm concerned, that is a load of malarkey. It is very clear that psychology is a subspecialty of neurology, and that that the psychological state is a branch of the nervous system, and it is, as far as I'm concerned, and what we consider to be metaphysicalism, the only metaphysiological part of our physiological function. We know that the cortexes that I just mentioned are directly responsible for the functionality, the entire presence and existence of emotions such as happiness, sadness, dreariness, amounts of enthusiasm, creativity, the process of dream regulation and memory encoding in that regard, imagination in regards to mental synthesis, severe feelings of depression, function of sexual arousal in relation to emotional connectivity amongst human beings. And cognitive, intellectual capabilities in critical thought. All of this is solely a function of the central nervous system, of synaptic connections between the different regions of the brain structure. Which is what forms the outwardly projected social manifestations in the metaphysical sense of socializing connectivity for human engagement. And it is the sole header, no pun intended, for in relation to categories of the psychological state in relation to its function, processes regarding mentality, personality / persona, personification, and behavioral tendencies. And in this regard, it's also, even though, despite the reluctance by many to view psychology as a sub-specialty of the study of the nervous system, it is still in the modern day regarded as a neuroscience. Psychology as a recognized by many who are within the scientific community in terms of career study as part of neuroscientific research, which is one of the biggest manufactured contradictions that I think I've ever heard. So let's say, in regards to the function of, in regards to my theories of the 5 inherent human desires in relation to, let's say, the response of conscious apathy. Someone gets aggravated by the fact that they dropped their favorite coffee cup that's made of, say, porcelain or ceramic, some sort of ceramic material, and it shattered into 1,000 pieces. They're angry, they're frustrated, they're upset, completely distraught, they're cursing like mad, and they're slamming their fist on a tabletop. Let's say this person is doing that. Well, on a psychobiological level, the reason that they are doing that, as far as I'm concerned, is because their 5 subconscious desires, meaning, control, understanding, uniqueness, and familiarity, resulting in subconscious willingness, has been disrupted. Well, the culminating in a conscious motivational response before they drop the mug. Well, it's been disrupted because of the shattering of the sentimental object, which is external conflict, external conflicting stimuli that has resulted in an apathetic conscious response now of aggression. The reason that this process on the psychological basis is even happening is because of neural connections within regions of the brain, such as the cingulate cortex. More specifically, it's been readily observed for the most part, and I would agree with, being the superior cingulate cortex and the temporal lobe. In regards to more so, that could be an example as well. In regards to more so the frontotemporal region. Second, so as far as studies go on human motivation, there is clear, highly prevalent activity within the superior cingulate cortex and with connections to the prefrontal cortex for the desire for motivating ourselves cognitively and propelling us towards daily activities, as well as for heavy control of enthusiasm in relation to the cingulate. In regards to anger and frustration, we know that neuronuclei connection during bouts of agitation, whether with major physical displays of aggression or not, more internalized, heavy synaptic transmission activity. In that regard, connections to axons. Heavy activity within the frontotemporal region, as well as activation of the amygdala within the limbic system. And four, during bouts of aggression, the decision-making process for moral judgment or actions that you engage with during bouts of anger connections or activity within the brain structure in the frontal prefrontal region, sending clearly activating neurons within the amygdala, as well as thus triggering connections to the temporal lobe. And the amygdala, in regards to the psychobiological presence, for my theories of conscious apathy, there's clear evidence that temporal activity in relation to aggression that triggers the amygdala, well, that only really occurs because of an anxiety presence or a relation to fearfulness. We know that the amygdala controls responses of fear, stress, anxiety, and release of the hormone to the hippocampal, amygdala, and pituitary axis of cortisol and adrenaline, as well as reactionary time in regards to, say, things such as flinching responses or fight or flight response. In that regard, it's very clear that said aggression in relation to the temporal lobe, as far as I'm concerned, is provably a reaction to subconscious fear. In that regard, disrupt to our subconscious desires. So, in essence, as to the person getting incredibly aggravated, frustrated, and upset, the fact that they smashed their mug, the reason this is even happening is because of neural connectivity between those regions of the brain in regards to the physical motions of, say, slamming their fist on a countertop or cursing. Well, sending connective signals in regards to connections with the basal ganglia for motor functionality, the physical response of aggression, such as movement of your arm for a physically aggressive or violent motion, and in regards to speech articulation, with the formation of language being controlled by the frontal cortex for conceptual knowledge of language and semantic memory in relation to the hippocampus and the prefrontal cortex for words that have formed about in cultural surroundings from, well, linguistic formation of language depending on cultural environment, sending signals to the parietal lobe and thus then to the pons medullary axis of the brainstem, as well as, well, in regards to connections there, to the, I forget the entire name of it, but the, I'll talk about it later in the video, in relation to the parietal function, the dorsal laryngeal, it's a region within the parietal cortex. Anyway, sending signals to the laryngeal nerve endings to then control actions of the vocal cords, and also send signals to the peripheral nervous system of the face here for speech articulation, and the process of muscular movement and skeletal movement of the jaw and the lips. So for function, in that regard, for function of vocalization and articulation. So, those are examples of this theory. So, to reiterate, this is all provably inherent to what we consider to be the concept of intersectionality, of crucial connections between various realms of existence. And as far as I'm concerned, that is inherent to all of ontology as we know it, as we conceive it. So, to put it simply, you cannot do something in any form or any manner within your life, in any of your actions, that does not, in some way, major or minor, affect another facet of life as a whole. And that includes other human beings, other animal species, and non-living organisms within a shared collective environmental setting. On to my next new theory. The inseparable nature of structuralism to cognitive conceptualization. Philopsychology / neuropsychology. I submit the following conclusion, that the philosophical outline of structuralism, more specifically in regards to ontology and epistemology, is not only a crucial element to human social system functioning in terms of societal structuring, in regards to both regulatory, authoritarian, and non-regulatory, anarchist, and libertarian maximalist societal ideology, but is inherently rooted in all of human cognitive understanding in regards to conceptual knowledge / orientation. Of ideas that we become aware of and that we operate within. So, in this regard, there have been many who, in various realms of cognitive science, who, and not just cognitive science, in the entirety of all fields of examination, who have outlined elements of how structuralist principles are pretty much entirely woven into the process of how specific elements of said fields function. And in that regard, for my further outlining of this, I believe that the concept of structuralism doesn't just have, similar to my last theory, it doesn't just have certain key importance to facets of human existence in regards to our emotional, metaphysical process for intellectualization, and cognition as a whole, but is the basis of how we, in terms of gained knowledge, orient everything in terms of, say, even so much as giving something a name. Now, there are probably those of you wondering what specifically is structuralism. Well, the philosophy of structuralism mainly outlines the fact that within the realms of existence, there are key components that go into making up the basic foundations of how a specified thing operates. This is for, even though for my outlining here, I'm more specifying towards ontology and epistemology, this relates to all realms of philosophy and all realms of human social functioning, as far as I'm concerned, but in that regard, so also morality, metaphysics, phenomenology, axiology, all of it. Now, how can I prove this? Well, here's some examples.
November 10th. So, examples for how structuralism is innate to human cognitive conceptualization. Well, let's first take, say, self-identification. More so on the basis of what personhood is. Not even more in a more specified sense. Like picking at specific things that we psychologically attribute to our identities. More so the entire idea of what being a person is. Just say from the very notion of stating, well, like every other human being, I'm a person. Well, let's look at that statement in and of itself. You have a possessive ideal, I am, in egotistical sense. You have, saying a person, you are stating what the thing is. And then you have, well, placement of the concept of what a person is, well, in and of itself, representative of. Typically, what is considered to be a person is any sentient being with the ability to form critical analysis or have a assigned and observed personality, character, distinctions, or the ability, especially philosophically, to make moral judgment, form moral conclusions. So, in just that short statement alone, I am a person, you have basically a three formation structure. What would another one be? Well, let's say let's go with the notion of saying that thing is an object. And I'll get into this in a second. It doesn't matter what language you say these statements in, whether that language is verbal or nonverbal. It's the sentiment that's expressed and what is conceptually believed and understood. Again, similar to the personhood example, let's not take a look at a more specific identity of an object. What is an identity, a name assigned to an object? Let's just say, insert whatever here. That thing is an object. Okay, well, you're starting with the idea of that thing, or even just so much as saying that. You are, metaphysically speaking, I'm doing it right now, but pointing to an exact identity of the thing, that it is something. That you're identifying it as that, even if you don't say the word or represent it with any other word that means thing. That thing is an object. Well, then you're stating what it is in terms of its function, or what a specific, say, more in a cultural setting, what is, well, this can also be on an individual basis, but what is either thought of by an individual as being the set purpose or the assigned purpose, the innate purpose or the assigned purpose of that thing, or collectively, what a demographic of people understand that thing to have the function of. what it serves to do. That thing is and then you have the idea of it being an object. Well, what is the idea of an object? It is something, at least widely recognized across the board, in just the conceptual knowledge of, well, things that are objectified in the idea of being an object, which could apply morally to it either being beneficial or detrimental in terms of seeing it as an object, but nonetheless still being considered an object. An object is typically agreed on as being something that is utilized for the functionality of something, for bringing about or continuing, well, a set outcome. You use an object to, again, physically or metaphysically, bring about a desired end goal, where it serves a purpose to be continued as such. In the idea of an object's at the very least desired purpose, again in assigned value, not in an axiologic sense, or put further in an axiologic regard, what its innate function is without the human sentimental value towards it. So you have the identification of what the thing is. You have stating its function, and then you have the idea of either its innate value axiologically, or its assigned value in a ontological, moral, or aesthetical sense. So again, really in that sentence structure alone, in terms of linguistics, three-step structure. Now, you might be thinking, well, Cam, but again, this is just stating the idea. This is, again, whether verbal or non-verbal, it's just a construct that's cultivated by people to give an understanding to whatever the specific topic is. That these structural concepts can cognitively just be let go and seen for what they really are. No. Because why don't you take a look at actually the idea of that notion in and of itself? You can take just the idea of this notion, that statement. You can take the socially constructed idea of what is assigned to insert here and see it for what it originally is. That's a structure. You're talking from your perspective, or from, say, another, if you're inserting it onto me, another person's perspective, that you can look at this thing. You can look at it, you can observe it outside of the conceived idea. That is a cognitive structure in and of itself. You have the egotistical statement of your sense of self, or another person's sense of self. You have the action. You have the idea of the action that you can set forth. You can take that thing and examine it. You have, let's just say, solely calling it a social construct. You can examine that identified thing, assigning an identity to it, a social construct, which is in and of itself, as I'm trying to get across, a social construct. And that you can see it outside of the humanly assigned identification of it. Well, it's the reality. The notion that it's simply just a social construct is another identity to it. It's another social construct. It's another form of identification to help you cognitively, structurally orient your knowledge around the said thing. And this is why, in all regards now, I absolutely think the philosophy of postmodernism is pretty well entirely nonsensical. Modernism is also nonsensical. Now, I've done videos talking about this before. And in one of them, when I was in law, I stated that maybe my morality and my ideologies align more with the idea of post-structuralism to some degree. Well, no, I can safely say absolutely not. Post-structuralism is also, even more so, I think, than the idea of post-modernity, is a completely ridiculous philosophy. And I still do not know much about the concept of metamodernism. And though obviously, in relation to my last theory, what I'm speaking about here has an effect on the ideal of metamodernity. I don't know enough about it, so I'm not going to directly address it here. But I don't deny that the idea that, for the idea of modernism, that more so, I guess, what is typically conceived as humanity, especially in this Eurocentric view, reaching this pinnacle point in history of ideas and intellectual knowledge, that we should move away from that era of understanding and orienting ourselves in the world, is completely stupid and ridiculous, and it denounces and dismisses any other potential new ideas that would be beneficial to humanity. But postmodernism, in regards to the idea that, well, anything in relation to either a set specific point in time, or, and I guess what you could call a more neo-modernist idea of abiding by the pinnacle of whatever the modern era at a specific point in time may be, of sociocultural phenomena that persist. That's the pinnacle of knowledge and human socialization and function. In regards to the idea that in postmodernity you can move away from the idea of there ever being and I guess in a beneficial sense, a set point where all further knowledge stops, just stops coming about, which would be accurate, I think. But by doing that, you let go of the idea of social constructs created because of this idea that constructing identities and labels or notions for an ideology, that letting go of that is somehow a relief of suppression and oppression underneath a set social standard, status quo. Well, that's completely paradoxical in and of itself, and manufacturedly at that. Because that whole notion, one, is an ideology in and of itself. Two, is a social construct. And anyone who identifies as postmodernist, well, by your own logic, you shouldn't even be identifying as postmodernist. If the idea of a social construct can be just done away with and we don't need it to orient our conceived knowledge intellectually, well, really, you shouldn't be identifying with anything. Again, I don't mean this just in a verbal sense. A way to concretely prove this theory is if you believe that you can emotionally and cognitively just release yourself of orienting your entire understanding around social constructs, then I want you to not assert mentally, not out loud, non-verbal, verbal. I want you to try that. Actually realize, and if you believe that you can just simply let go of conceived ideas and notions, I want you to mentally do that in your head right now. Okay, and if you're saying, well, if you're mentally saying to yourself, okay, well, I let go of the notion that I can assert an identity system thing. You already failed. You stated I. Assertion of your ego. You stated the process of what can be done. You stated what you are trying to rid yourself of. And all of that, in just simply knowing what it is, knowing the fact that you want to rid yourself of that, knowing the fact of, well, in that essence, I want to rid myself of that. Given that we share an understanding of this knowledge once we are familiarized to that knowledge, well, social construct. You don't have to say it out loud for it to be a construct. So as far as I'm concerned, modernism is a terrible philosophy. This idea as if, well, these, for whatever society and the ideologic cultures that form within that society, that this is just a definitive point in history of this, of either this specific demographic or of various demographics within the entirety of the society, that it just stops here. This is the pinnacle of societal operation, and there's no room for disproving that functioning in light of something that's provably better. Well, that's terrible. That's not progressive. And for postmodernism also, and post-structuralism, it's a terrible solution to that already terrible philosophy. It's merely stating that the way to release ourselves from a set confined ideal with the correct notion that conceptual knowledge and how it's expressed should just be limited to what's come about at a certain point in history. That the solution to that is to let go of all notion of a construct, of social constructs, and how they form. Was completely ridiculous because that's innate to human cognitive function. It's innate to human philopsychology. Now, I'll use this as another example. I recently was told about, and I tried further researching into this tribal group. I was told about a indigenous Asian Indian tribal group that was part of, it was Nagaland ethnic group in the Indian state of Nagaland. I don't remember the name. Fully, I don't know if I had the correct one. but I believe it was the something along the lines of the Koyaka people or the Kanaka people, the Konyaka people. If anyone knows, please feel free to correct me. Apparently, in the civilization functioning of this group, like many in the past world, functioned in a egalitarian type, communitarian, collective society, and operated in pseudo-communistic fashion. But interestingly enough, in their language, the language they spoke, they had no word. In fact, just in terms of social arrangements and social presentation and expression overall, they had no way of externally expressing the ego, the psychological sense of self and self-importance. They didn't have a word to represent in, say, the English language, I, or me, or mine, or my. And they also apparently didn't even have what would be asserted as more collective wording, such as us, or our, or we. They didn't have representative wording, or really even much blatantly visible external expression of what would be considered more egotistical personality traits. Because in how the group had formed in social, cultural values was that of believing that the tribe was one, that everyone in the tribe benefited from one another. And European colonialism absolutely ruined and destroyed their cultural, ideological functioning. Absolutely devastated it. But not because, as far as I'm concerned, of introducing the idea of more internally selfish understanding psychologically. You could claim this as proof that certain cultural ideals towards more self-centered actions are one, morally a destructive ideal and concept, but two, that they're just, again, a concept, just a construct that we've created that's constraining and destructive. Well, no. Because if you examine that structurally, it doesn't matter the fact, as far as I'm concerned, what is known in psychology all across the world, from influence of various people demographics, of the input into the psychological field. As I stated before, it doesn't matter whether you're more externally expressive of the ego. You cannot get rid of the sense of self. Cognitively, what that group clearly did was being raised in that cultural environment. The understanding of your sense of self is to be one with the group and to help in function and benefit of the entire group. That's still an orientation of each person within that group, their individual egos, to a collective function. It's not, oh, they don't have egos, they don't have an understanding of the ego. Even if they don't have an expression for it, they don't have, in terms of, say, linguistic communication or any other form of physical or overall, you could say, metaphysical expression. Well, in terms of their own understanding of where from the cultural environment they're raised in, where them as an individual fall into, again, even without a word or method of expressing individuality, still understand and orient the self-centered want, or the internally selfish want, as far as I'm concerned, for community involvement, pro-socialization, and understanding of utilizing themselves to benefit the collective, even without an expression for it. Because to propel yourself into that action of collective work requires the understanding of where you, a possessive understanding of, possessive in relation to your ego, where you fall in to contributing to the group's prosperity. That's still a conceived construct. So you can count that as another example. Again, I'm sorry I don't completely remember the group's name, but I recently learned about them. They're an Indian ethnic group, or an ethnic group, a Nagaland ethnic group that's common to, obviously, Nagaland. So you can take that as another example. So, well, I think those examples alone prove it well enough of how conceived knowledge has, once you break it down, verbally or non-verbally, and in relation to non-verbally, an internal analysis process, if you look, say, on a more introspective level, how you orient your understanding of something. It has a step-by-step process and foundation, a metaphysical foundation. It has a beginning, it has an end. It has a structure. You can't just say that, well, it's all a trick of the mind. Well, as far as I'm concerned, one, that's ignorance towards psychology. And two, it's just a trick of the mind the identity is just its function, what it's supposed to do, a trick of the mind, what it orients as. So and what it's, in that regard, assigned value is its overall orientation. Now, before I move on to explaining some more things about my theoretical and implementation work, and then going on to my influences for them, I also just want to take a moment to address something in regards to what I think many who think of themselves as post-structuralists, especially in regards to societal functioning. I think that many get the concept itself confused with something else, which is why they view themselves as being of the idea for the dismantlement of all structuralist ideals. There is a difference between the philosophy of structuralism and the ideology of legalism, governmental legalism, what is permitted in a judicial sense within any sort of governed law in a society, if it's more authoritarian, or even going into the notion of more leftist libertarianism. Just simply having a notion of structure is not anti-anarchist. It's not promoting the idea of a set legal regiment in a regulatory fashion in terms of proposed legislature and policing enforcement and military enforcement of the law. It is merely the idea that there are foundations that we as human beings orient ourselves upon. That there is clearly a basic there's basic building blocks, metaphysical building blocks to how we conceive things. And in that regard, the entire ideology, and I've talked about this before on here as well, in relation to the paradox of existence, naturally occurring double standards within the innate contradictions of life as a whole. In that regard, anarchy is inherently structural as well, not in a legal sense, in a conceptualized sense. You have the idea that there should be, in a governmental sense, no state power in the slightest, the dismantlement of all set regulatory rules and policies, policed systems, and a regimen of control. Well, and that in a social anarchist thought, we should operate within a collective sense to be malleable for individual and collective needs, to not have a set governed system. That in and of itself is structural. If people were abiding by that, in say a community of some kind with no set inherent legislature to dictate a regulatory enforcement, and people were willing to operate in a social system, that's still a system. That's still a structure. That's still, even if it's malleable, it's just a shifting structural system. You're agreeing to function with a group, people, whatever placement a person may have. You're agreeing with it. You're working collectively with someone without any set regulation. That is, it still has a process to it, even with its, in relation to anarchist thought, inherent flexibility. So I guess that's just one more thing I wanted to add to that. So, all right, now on to further discussion of clarifying certain things, newer developments with my other theories, and then to those that have influenced them. So, to start with, well, just going over more specifics of my theoretical work, I'll talk about my now laminated diagrams. As you would have seen in, well, the second part of my Dispelling Social Myths, well, the second video of that little series, but as of current it is not available on the channel. I just want to clarify something. Well, yeah, mainly two things. So, in regards to my diagram for the 5 inherent human desires, interactive loneliness, and biologic thanatophobia. So, I'll go over the process again. We psychobiologically function on the basis of 5 subconscious desires, meaning control, understanding, uniqueness, and familiarity. This culminates in a subconscious sense of willingness, to propel us towards obtaining things within our lives, physical and metaphysical, that we think can gratify the subconscious desires, which then leads to the conscious psychological response of motivation. That can go one of three ways: either to uttermost fulfillment, to where your subconscious and conscious emotional state is, well, satisfied well enough by what has been obtained in your actions. There could be, the other option is external conflict can arise, which in that regard would lead to internal conflict. That would disrupt motivation and lead to the conscious psychological response of apathy. And if disruption to motivation is recurrent well enough, that can result in apathetic psychological disorders and conditions that disrupt pro-socialization caused by interactive loneliness. And the third option, which I think is the least likely, is that you can become over-fixated on motivational response cognitively, and this can lead to motivational psychological disorders and conditions, which also disrupt pro-socialization. Now, in regards to the diagram itself, to clear up confusion, because there was someone who I spoke to about my theoretical work at one point a while back, when my theories were in their early stages of development in Ottawa. And they were a little confused by my explanation. And I think also someone who I met in Laval, who I showed my diagrams to, they were also confused slightly. Once apathetic psychological disorders have occurred, or motivational disorders, as I am a firm believer of this, that is not indefinite, and there are treatments for disorders that form from it, and moral corruption that may develop as a result of said disorders. There are ways to mitigate morally disruptive elements of disorders. But in regards to once disruption has occurred to motivation, and say you just enter into what would be general apathy, not the complete formation of a mental personality or behavioral disorder, you're not, I don't mean this as if you're going to stay in constant apathy, or that certain people can obtain fulfillment and others will constantly be disrupted, and it'll just be a never-ending repetitive cycle of apathy. That's not what I mean at all. When I say recurring disruption here, in relation to the apathetic response and the protection mechanism, subconscious protection mechanism of biologic thanatophobia, what I mean there is, well, for the recurring disruption, is what would result in psychological disorders forming as an abnormal thanatophobic protection reaction to that. once, and even when those disorders form, so both in general apathy, and even as far as I'm concerned when motivational or apathetic psychological illness becomes apparent, you will still find new things that propel you towards meaning, control, understanding, uniqueness, and familiarity. Problematically so with the formation of disorders and what can occur potentially in relation to disorders forming because of conditions that aren't inherently disorderly. It's just I can't draw that. That's the most basic answer I can give. I had no idea how I could possibly draw that. Once you've entered into an apathetic response, if there is no present disorder, you most likely will just you'll bounce right back to motivation, because something else will immediately subconsciously draw you towards or entice your attention towards fulfilling the subconscious desires. You're not in like this never-ending state of apathy. And again, with the formation of motivational or apathetic disorders, even then, very clearly, there's remnants of being propelled towards, well, a will to meaning, control, understanding, uniqueness, and familiarity to keep you alive. And in relation to biologic thanatophobia, that is provable because in relation to more pessimistic outlooks of humanity or misanthropic outlooks of humanity, or depressive feelings towards the state of your situation in life and the world around you. Well, as far as I'm concerned, in relation to suicidality, you would have ended your life long ago. So, just to clarify, it just resets, as far as I'm concerned. I can't draw that. If anyone else is able to redesign my diagrams and draw that for how, with an apathetic response and with the formation of psychological illness in regards to disrupt to pro-socialization, if you're able to draw that, I'd be more than happy to see that. Please do. Actually, that would be much better for anyone who'd be confused on that. But just know that the only reason that there's no further connections than that of where you would regain from the 5 subconscious desires a draw to willingness, even with the disorders, I can't draw that. I don't know how. And, I think this diagram is already intricate and convoluted enough. So that's the best I could come up with that, and for that. And the same goes for the unempathic, unsympathetic cycle of conflict. I do not mean... Okay, so in relation to a theory of the unempathic, unsympathetic cycle of conflict, as far as I'm concerned, sociopathic / dismissive anti-socialization and projection of uncompassionate personality characteristics towards an oppressed group or an individual from an oppressor, and vice versa, projection of psychopathic lack of empathy towards an oppressor, towards an oppressive group or an individual, will solely result in a repetitive cycle of conflict. It will cause a repetition, problematic repetition as far as I'm concerned, that will just solely reaffirm to the opposing party that the other is a threat to them, to their existence, and they must be quelled by force or by alienation and complete lack of care, lack of empathy and sympathy towards them. But in this regard, again, to the diagram that I drew, it's not this never-ending cycle of humanity just being this uncompassionate and oppressive force, as if these conflicts between people demographics or individuals, if influenced issues, societal issues that influence interpersonal issues, and then vice versa, as if it'll just never end. That cycle will only end, as far as I'm concerned, in whatever given scenario, if compassion or attempts at compassionate understanding are introduced. That is how the cycle will be broken. You can't quell it with lack of compassion or remorse. So no, it's not like this it's not a never-ending cycle. Don't anyone get confused about that. That's just, I couldn't think of a way to draw it. It's merely trying to showcase this diagram, how when that cycle of conflict is occurring, why it is. So yeah, I just couldn't draw it. And okay, yeah, so it was just for those two that I want to further really specify and clarify that, but I will actually, hold on a second. November 12th. So, change of plans. Gonna have to scrap the original intention of, well, going into a bit more depth on certain details for my work, because good old internal storage is telling me that I don't have enough room. So I won't have time for that. So instead, I'm going to just list the people who have influenced my work, and then at the end, touch on a bit of certain further aspects of my work. Slight bit only. So, Dr. Carl Gustav Jung, a Swiss psychologist, psychoanalyst, neuropsychologist, and philosopher, who posed theories of
the collective unconscious, the ego and the unconscious, persona and the shadow, and came up with an outline for personality archetypes, heavily influenced in what would now be considered clusters A and B personalities. Along with that, the outlining of a specific form of identity crisis known as the midlife crisis. Dr. Edward B. Bynum, an American psychologist and psychosociologist who has proposed the theory and outlining of the African unconscious and has done a heavy amount of work in showcasing the mass spiritual traditional influence of various African of Black ethnocultural presence for the influence of the field of psychology, and how much of Afro-mysticism went into the creation of that portion and other fields of the scientific community. An experimental thesis by a psychiatric student, an American psychiatric student, in the 1980s, I believe, the University of Missoula, in the American state of Montana, on basically the frustration to aggression principle, and also in relation to how fear responses, or how subconscious fear responses are the main controlling force behind conscious aggression responses. Dr. Shalom H. Schwartz, a Canadian cultural psychologist / psychosocioanalyst / Jewish rabbi, who proposed the theory of basic human values, where he outlined key distinctions in terms of basically our moral functioning overall, and the essence of what they represent in various demographics. Key patterns that were noticeable, and what his belief go into making up our core, well, my theory would be our subconscious desires, but would influence any amount of ethical decision making. Friedrich Nietzsche, a German philosopher, sociologist, genealogist, composer, poet, etc., and his work in initially outlining the ontological philosophy of nihilism, and his further contributions to the philosophy of optimistic nihilism, and just in general his contributions to existentialism as a whole. And I primarily take influence from his own philosophical belief of affirming the unconditional embrace of life, or as it's often referred to, Nietzsche's cure for nihilism, as well as his example outlining of what he called the repetition of the same.
Dr. Leonard Berkowitz, an American clinical psychologist / philopsychologist, and his further additions to the frustration to anger principle. Dr. Viktor Frankl, an Austrian neurologist, psychiatrist, and philosopher who presented the theory that human beings are unconsciously drawn towards a will to meaning, or as he outlined it, and his work in what would go on to be known as logotherapy. Felix Skura, an American YouTube commentator, and his contributions to the philosophy of optimistic nihilism and his own personal theory that human beings are subconsciously have their own idealistic viewpoints of how they perceive the world and do enact, engagements in their physical lives to try and gratify that subconscious idealism. Shiheng Yi, a German Shaolin monk / martial artist / philosopher, and his contributions to the practices of Zen Buddhism and Taoism, and his spiritual outlinings and takes on Stoic principles. Professor Uri Alon, a Israeli systems biologist and teacher of such, and his digraphic outlining of the phenomenon often referred to as the cloud amongst the scientific community. Dr. Alok Kanogia, otherwise known as, mainly online, Dr. K, and his various interviews with participants, and his discussions on various psychological health topics. Dr. Karen Horney, a German psychologist / psychosociologist, and her outlining and her further outlinings in psychosexology and disputing Freudian orthodoxy in the psychological field, and further work involving the psychological trauma response, that is, internalized misogyny, and her theory of neurotic needs to human beings, that individual people operate on a basis of neurotic desires that are, in essence, basically, I guess you could consider them, in, the ways her works outline it, compulsive. Professor Mahmood Mamdani, an Indian-Ugandan teacher of political science and international conflict, and cultural phenomena, and his outlining of internalized racism, or further additions to it, and the taking on of oppressive ideals from an oppressor, and in a position of being an oppressor to a group of people, the outlining of and the outlining of the erosion of initially demographic practices, and then the reinvention of them, basically, or the pandering to such, in a modern sense. Dr. Gabor Mati, a Hungarian clinical physician and author, who is currently based in Vancouver, British Columbia, Canada, and his work in regards to childhood trauma and his theories in expression of authenticity, or of authentic initial personality characteristics, and the psychological suppression of, during childhood, the initial traits of individuals, and the rehealing process of attempting to rekindle and express the, desires of, in his circle of spiritual thought, what's often referred to as the inner child. Albert Camus, a French writer, philosopher, and philosophical analyst, and his outlining some personal philosophy of absurdism, and his further contributions in that to the philosophies of existential nihilism and optimistic nihilism. Noam Chomsky, an American psycholinguist, sociologist, socioanalyst, and prominent intellectual figure in that regard, especially for anarchist and libertarian thought, specifically take from his propaganda model, manipulation propaganda model of the mass journalist media, and his theory of manufacturing consent, along with his linguistics theory of universal grammar. Dr. Frances Fanon, a French West Indian psychiatrist who was a prominent figure in writing about the colonialism across the African continent, of colonialism all throughout Africa, and its vast destructive sociological effects on the Black diaspora. I specifically take influence from his theory of the colonizer of any given land needing to, in order to subjugate the demographic that was initially the inhabitants of said land, and enforce their ideals onto them, they have to destroy the cultural presence and practices of said group. Professor Manning Marable, an American political science educator and writer who has worked extensively in research regarding American Black culture, especially within the southern half of the United States, and I take the inspiration from his writings on capitalism's destructive presence amongst the American Black communities, and especially in regards to how both classical and neoliberalism, some degree or another, offered certain prospects to the American Black community, and the cultural suppression offered prospects of so-called liberation, and then time and again failed upon said delivery of prospects. Professor Sun Michaud, a sociolinguist at Harvard University in the United States, and a YouTube commentator as well as TikTok commentator as well, known for his teachings in regards to Gullah Geechee culture and the Gullah Geechee language and linguistic presence within the Gullah Geechee corridor of the eastern half of America. And I take influence from his various sociological commentary on matters of the such. Runsford James, or as he's better known on the internet as Foreign Man in a Foreign Land, a Bahamian political scientist and YouTube commentator who has done various talks on, especially in regards to the over-exotification and commodification of Black cultural aspects for mass, sociocultural appropriation and capitalist exploitation. And as well as talks in regards to the misunderstandings and misusage of Black spiritual elements in pop culture. Olivia Sun, or as she's better known on the internet as Oli Sunvia. Oh, wow. Okay. Oli Sunvia, a YouTube political commentator. She does talks, especially in regards to mass capitalist exploitation, philosophical discussions on moral dilemmas that are present, especially in the modern sense, especially in regards to Gen Z culture and online internet cultures and subcultures, as well as sensitive talks into over-exotification of East Asian cultural traditions and fashion attire. This will not focus. Khadija Mabawi, a Canadian Gambian YouTube commentator who does, again, talks in relation to Gen Z cultural influence and issues in relation to internet culture and subcultures, and mainly those oriented around more pop cultural influence. But I especially draw influence in her work for mine in regards to talks on relationship dynamics, in regards to monogamy, non-monogamy, polyamory, things of the sort. Madison Brown, a YouTube commentator and musician who, again, does many pop cultural commentary bits in regards to the presence of, similar to Khadija as well, the presence of patriarchy amongst internet culture and mass misogyny, as well as touches on the topic of matriarchy as well, in that sense. So, yeah, that's another. Gabe Corandillo, I hope I pronounced his last name right. I don't know his nationality, but a YouTube commentator who mainly does talks oriented around the extensive influence of ableism, especially in regards to his experience with cerebral palsy, and how incelism has spread across the internet and internet culture, and its destructive influence as well in that regard. Nicholas Lumas, I forget his exact profession, but has worked in writing and talks of the, similar to Noam Chomsky, of mass media manipulation, but from a different angle of what I would consider, in relation to the paradox of existence, inherent manipulative traits of media production, in relation to his theory of the reality of the mass media. James Fallon, an American neuroscience professor who has done various written work in regards to the personality disorder of psychopathy / sociopathy. Chimamanda Ngozi Adichie, a Nigerian writer and activist. I specifically take influence from her work in regards to commentary on feminism and how it is a universal and egalitarian in its innate form ideology, equal in that regard to masculinism, and especially in her, I'd also take influence from her philosophy of, as she calls, the danger of a single story. Professor Robert Sapolsky, an American neuroendocrinologist researcher who has done extensive work in outlining and examining the the connections between the nervous system and the endocrine system in relation to hormonal and neurochemical production and its influences over our cognitive and in that regard physiological behavior for enactment and psychological functioning as well, and elements taken from his belief of biological determinism, though I am still very much a situationist in terms of psychology. And the last person I will cite right now, John George Butler, an English Christian spiritual teacher and author. He's done extensive commentary on YouTube on the practices of meditation in regards to combination of biblical understanding and practice and extensive commentary on his experience trying to deal with the, well, very much hindering elements of innate human life and influences of the external world. And there are more people that I can list for influences, but I've run out of time. And I'm unfortunately also not going to be able to go into even the slightest bit amount more of details regarding my work at this moment. Because, yeah, not enough storage. And I've got to upload this video. So, that'll have to be saved for another time. Maybe some amount in the next video. Four days ago, November 8th, was exactly a month to my 20th birthday. Let's hope I live to see it. So, I'm just going to throw this little message in here at the end, because to some degree it pertains to what I will have discussed here in the video, but also because, well, just with the passage of Halloween yesterday, well, in terms of certain customary celebrations that are mainly common here in North America and portions of Western Europe and then in Oceania, in regards to dressing up and makeup, well, yes, I'd just like to quickly say that to any of the children out there, the LGBTQ children who are in severely homophobic, transphobic, agenderphobic, etc. households, or are communally surrounded by mass prejudice, who know that Halloween is one of their few chances
throughout the year to adorn something like this. And actually expressed their desired gender persona, well, or in regards to sexual attraction, cultural attire attributed to such. Well, I hope that you're able to enjoy those few hours while they last without any major conflict arising from the enjoyment. And I hope that someday you're able to predominantly, as much as possible, escape that situation, despite how prevalent it is everywhere as of the modern world, but to a point where you're able to wear something like this more than one day of the year. So, happy Halloween, even though, yes, as of regards to the video I made last year, me going over psychological manipulation tactics and how they're used and how they present themselves. I know, I uploaded on November 1st. Leave me alone.